Hello, I'm Dan Stowens and I'm a medical doctor, a neurologist, pediatric neurologist, retired now. There have been an awful lot of words written about the neurology of religion in quite reputable, believable, truly scientific books and journals, as well as an enormous amount of plain old bull in lots of other places. Just a simple Google of neuroscience of religion turns up more than 800,000 hits, and a whole journal with scientific, quasi-scientific, unscientific articles, method and theory in the study of religion. A simpler search on brain and God turns up more than 83 million hits, and just brain God yields 105 million hits, with titles like The God Brain and How Your Brain is Wired for God, and The God Gene, and Evolution of Worship. Granted, that last one is from a religion blog, but still it's understandable how somebody might come up with the idea that the brain evolved to worship God. So, how can I stand up here and say absolutely that the brain has not evolved to worship God when all those zillions of people seem to be saying the opposite? Easy. Science. I'd like to talk about three subjects that have to do with biology that I suspect some of you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. Complex systems, science, behavior, evolution. Well, yes, of course, you've thought about the last two, and any of you who are parents have spent a huge amount of time thinking about behavior for sure, but probably not the way I'm going to describe it. So, take a breath and a fresh slug of coffee. Here we go. Biology is the science of life. That means it's the whole collection of observations and explanations for those observations of living things. My definition of science, of course, for this talk. And altogether, that science is complicated. More than that, it's complex. Now, people have been thinking about what that means for thousands of years. Well, a few thousand years anyway. It appears the Greeks thought about it. And quite recently, we've been able to analyze it, study it, talk about it, define it, so we can use it in thinking about science. It being complexity. We've learned that there are some things about complex systems that help greatly in understanding science, how to mentally organize what we've learned. Great. But what does that mean anyway? Here's a working explanation, an example of what it means with regards to biology. Within a complex system, information about that system falls into conceptual ranges or scopes or scales. So, in biology, we could talk about the chemistry going on in terms of atoms. All the information we've gathered on atoms, though, doesn't tell us anything about molecules, not a thing about combinations of atoms. We can't use our knowledge of atoms to say anything about molecules because the collections of information are separate. They're in different conceptual ranges or scales. Then we can turn around and say, okay, here's what we know about molecules. What does that tell us about DNA? Well, it tells us a lot about the molecule DNA, but absolutely nothing about genes. Different conceptual or integrative level. So we learn the shit out of genetics and discover that that tells us nothing about the group of proteins that are called receptor molecules that the genes code, and nothing about those receptors that are neurotransmitter receptors. And learning everything about neurotransmitter molecules and their receptor molecules reveals nothing about synapses or cell-to-cell communications. And then Nothing about synapses helps us with neural circuits. And neural circuits tell us nothing about primitive thinking. Primitive thinking tells us nothing about compound thoughts or ideas. And, well, we've not yet agreed about how to think about thoughts at all, so I'll stop there. You get the idea. Knowledge at one level doesn't help with a level above it, or below it for that matter. Okay, so how does that help us with the original idea, the title? Well, I phrased the title specifically to point this out. Evolution here is meant to mean evolution as Darwin described, and that we now know has to do with genes. Remember genes way down here in the hierarchy? And belief in God is way up here in the upper levels of thinking. So there's an absolute disconnect between them. We could go on and on about this, but that's pretty much what I wanted to introduce into the discussion. Scientific knowledge has to be organized in a hierarchical way, has to be. And it's very difficult to navigate from one level to another close to it. It's impossible to navigate across multiple levels. Searching the net reveals all sorts of articles if you'd like to go into this a little bit more. Here are some terms to start with. Complex system or complex systems or complexity theory or integrative levels, what I call conceptual levels, or the biggie, emergence. Behavior to a scientist is anything caused by the nervous system working. So, tapping on the knee and getting the muscles to jerk is eliciting behavior. Shining a light in an eye and getting the pupil to contract is eliciting behavior. Farting in an elevator and getting a disgusted look on someone's face is eliciting behavior. The bazillions of scientific papers that talk about, examine, analyze, measure behavior are referring to this definition or use of the word. And that's not what we parents mean when we talk about behavior. We're talking about something else. We're thinking about much more complicated actions with one major critically important difference from the other behaviors in scientific usage. And that difference is choice. When we talk about behavior, we mean activity that someone has chosen to do. Not reflex actions, not reactions, not automatic responses, not emotional expressions, not trained or untrained actions, choices. That's what we mean when we talk about behavior. Sure, we're talking about things caused by the nervous system working, scientific behavior, but just a part of that scientific behavior, the behavior that is chosen. Think a moment about that. The activity we're talking about is chosen. That means that there are alternatives involved. And the most fundamental feature of the type of activity we mean when we're talking about behavior is the option to not behave in a certain way. Now, there certainly is biology, gene-determined aspects of the brain underlying behavior of all definitions. And for sure, there is biology underlying the thinking about, talking about, doing stuff with regards to religion and gods. The problem with stating something like the human brain is hardwired to believe in God is that it's based on a complete misunderstanding of what is hardwired. Because, of course, believing in any sort of religious idea is the kind of behavior we parents are talking about, complicated and chosen. So what is hardwired is the kind of brain activity that allows us to choose. Without getting sidetracked into endless discussions of how the structure of the human brain supports the kind of thinking that ends up with choosing something, let's just rethink the original idea. The human brain has evolved to worship God. Nope. Worshipping a god and participating in religious activity is parental defined behavior, chosen. So what has really happened is the human brain has evolved to worship God or not to worship God. I have commented before on how people misunderstand evolution, how they misuse the word, how they're incorrect in a variety of ways. Well, I was wrong myself. I also misunderstood what was going on. Just a bit in my defense. They didn't know what they were talking about either, and they were, in fact, incorrect in a lot of what they were saying. But I am ashamed to admit how long it took me to understand the bigger picture of evolution, the truly general concept of evolution. Here's what I've come up with to explain my mistakes, with just a bit of refinement of the basic current definitions. Evolution is change by selection. Period. Note, in this use of evolution, selection is just that. Not competition, not natural or unnatural selection, not any specific kind of selection, just plain one thing as opposed to another. Using that explanation of evolution still allows us to explain biology, of course, even as complicated as the science has become. But it also makes a whole bunch of things possible to explain, or understand, or talk about, because lots, and lots, and lots, and lots, and lots, and lots, seriously, languages evolve, and lots of things evolve. Really? Yeah, let's think about that a bit. Fashion and style can evolve. What causes society to select a fashion style, a fall color, a hem length, an optimal bust size, and in haircut? I have no idea, but that's irrelevant. This kind of evolution happens regardless of the selection processes. It only depends on there being a selection process. Okay, so what about Darwin then? I'm so glad you asked that question because, you see, over the past 5 or 6 decades, thinking people have begun to recognize that the evolution of biology is a much more specific kind of process than we first thought. It is the changing of features of a very carefully defined system by a specific kind of selection. It's now called genetic evolution and recognized to be quite different from any other evolutions that we might dream up or discover. And that's the critical part of this discussion. It's different. So what we learn about genetic evolution does not necessarily apply to the other forms of evolution. This is a really good website for further information on genetic evolution, this Understanding Evolution website. Let's just go over a few of the components of genetic evolution. First, genetic evolution takes place under a very specific set of conditions. It occurs in a system. The elements of the system are living things. The basic unit of biology is the cell, so the most basic element of genetic evolution is the living cell. Now, Richard Dawkins and a whole slew of other biologists might argue that no, the basic unit in genetic evolution is the gene, and that might be theoretically useful, but so far I've not recognized anything that has evolved without the genes being inside a cell. And then, even further, in organisms made of more than one cell, I've not recognized anything evolving by genetic evolution that is smaller than the organism itself. So for me, Now, genetic evolution means the evolution of organisms. Now, at some point, those organisms have to die for this kind of evolution to work. And those organisms have to reproduce. And that reproduction has to be accurate to a great degree, but not 100%. Given all that, it's certainly possible to observe living things, study them, recognize features or processes involving them, measuring how they change, and within the system just described, come up with testable hypotheses about them. And then test those hypotheses, reject or change or accept them, and come up with new hypotheses, and on, until we end up with a collection of observations and explanations for those observations that is biology. Whoa there! Genetic evolution is biology? Yep. Just as you can think about cells as the basic unit of biology, evolution, genetic evolution, is a basic process of biology. Okay, that's a simple reminder of evolution in biology, genetic evolution. But one aspect is most important. Results from studying life and living things, studying genetic evolution, apply only to biology. Conclusions that might be reached about biologic systems are valid only within the evolutionary system as described: organisms, death, reproduction, fidelity, and mutation. So ideas and hypotheses and theories and conclusions about biology do not apply to psychology or sociology or archaeology. Those are all systems, fields of study that involve different elements, different processes, different, if you'll allow me, ways of evolving. Okay, the obvious. The science of life, biology, tells us nothing, cannot tell us anything about theology. Okay, what else? Thoughts can evolve. Memes, mental entities, can evolve. And in this kind of evolution, maybe there's competition for thought space, so one idea keeps other ideas from being thought about, but that doesn't mean those other ideas disappear, does it? Nah, they can come up at another time. So competition in this sense, in this meme-based system, is really just selection for any reason. So you might think about something you heard, or saw on Facebook, or read somewhere. Why did you think it? Maybe it was funny or sad or some other emotional adjective. Maybe it happened to perfectly agree with what you were thinking about at the moment. Or the opposite. It doesn't matter. You selected it to think about, and that made it your idea, and that in turn might have changed it, might have caused it to evolve. And then you might have passed it on. Just the passing it on added to it. You were attached to it. You joined the Facebook throngs and made it 1,000,002 shares. Or you added a comment to it. Or you put it in your own words. You changed it by selecting it for whatever reason. Because you thought it, it evolved. And then you put it out there so it could change some more, evolve some more. You could, if you wanted to, carry that idea, thoughts evolving, into something a bit more serious. You could think about how big ideas, ideas thought about by lots and lots of people, evolve. And you would end up thinking about something that has come to be recognized as cultural evolution. That's what all the noise is about, evolution and religion and all that. The completely different kind of evolution, cultural evolution, is how ideas change, how thinking changes, how themes developed in history. Let me just end with pointing out that cultural evolution does not involve genes, does not automatically involve competition, does not involve biology and genetic evolution, organisms, death, reproduction, fidelity, mutation, at all. Here's something for you all interested in following up on the idea of cultural evolution. A superb reference that goes into a whole lot more detail about some of what I'm talking about. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. So, there you have it. The human brain has evolved to worship God, represents a huge misunderstanding of the word evolve, is based on a completely erroneous concept of behavior, and has no basis in the reality of biology as a complex system. So, there you have it. There you go. Science to the death.